I have seen powerful men survive impossible negotiations, billion-dollar betrayals, and enemies waiting in the shadows. But nothing prepares a man for the moment a frightened whisper tells him that speaking a single word could destroy everything. William Castellano stepped out of the black luxury sedan nearly 3 hours earlier than anyone inside his estate expected. The late afternoon sun stretched long golden reflections across the marble driveway as the massive iron gates slowly closed behind him. His scheduled business meeting in Manhattan had ended unexpectedly when a major investor canceled at the last minute, leaving him with something he rarely enjoyed: time. The mansion stood peacefully beneath a cloudless sky, its towering white columns glowing in the warm light, while perfectly trimmed hedges surrounded fountains that had welcomed generations of guests. Everything looked exactly as it always did. Quiet, elegant, perfect. That was precisely why William immediately sensed something was wrong. The estate was never this silent when dozens of employees were preparing for an evening charity reception. Usually the distant sound of kitchen staff, gardeners, decorators, and maintenance crews blended into a familiar rhythm of organized activity. Today the silence felt unnatural, almost as though the house itself was holding its breath. Before William could reach the grand entrance, the heavy front door opened unexpectedly. Naomi Carter hurried down the wide stone steps, still wearing her simple black and white housekeeping uniform, her hands trembling slightly as she struggled to catch her breath. In the 4 months she had worked at the Castellano estate, she had never once approached William without permission. She had mastered the invisible routine shared by every member of the housekeeping staff. Clean quietly. Speak only when necessary. Never interrupt the boss. Yet today she ignored every rule she had carefully followed since her first day. She stopped only a few feet away, her dark eyes filled with urgency unlike anything William had ever seen. For a brief moment, she glanced nervously toward the upper windows of the mansion before stepping closer. Her voice became almost inaudible. Sir, if you trust me, please do not say a single word. William stared at her without answering. The request made no sense. Naomi swallowed hard and lowered her voice even further. Please, act like you never came home. She looked over her shoulder again, her breathing uneven as though every passing second mattered. William followed her gaze toward the second-floor balcony, but nothing appeared unusual. Curtains moved gently in the breeze. Fresh flowers decorated the railings exactly as they always did. Somewhere beyond the west garden a fountain continued its peaceful rhythm. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, yet Naomi's expression told a completely different story. She was not frightened for herself. She was frightened for him. Years of leading one of the most respected business empires in New York had taught William that panic often hid the truth, while quiet fear usually revealed it. Naomi had never given him a reason to doubt her honesty. She had never asked for favors, never complained, and never drawn attention to herself. For someone like her to deliberately stop him at the front entrance meant she believed silence was somehow safer than explanation. William noticed something else. Naomi was subtly positioning herself between him and the front door, as though trying to delay him without making it obvious to anyone watching from inside the mansion. He looked into her anxious eyes for another long moment before giving the smallest possible nod. Without speaking another word, he slowly stepped backward into the shadow cast by the mansion's stone columns. And for the first time in many years, William Castellano entered his own home as though he were an uninvited stranger. 6 hours earlier, the Castellano estate had been alive with its usual rhythm of quiet perfection. Morning sunlight streamed through towering windows, casting long ribbons of gold across polished marble floors, while the scent of fresh lilies drifted through every hallway. Housekeepers moved silently from room to room. Gardeners trimmed the immaculate hedges surrounding the fountains, and chefs prepared ingredients for the evening reception that would welcome several distinguished guests. Naomi Carter had already been working since 6 o'clock that morning. She carried a basket of freshly pressed linens along the third-floor corridor, following the same routine she had memorized over the past 4 months. She preferred that no one noticed her. Being invisible made her work easier and kept life simple. She dusted priceless artwork, polished antique furniture, and quietly replaced fresh towels without interrupting the conversations of the wealthy people whose lives seemed unimaginably different from her own. The third floor rarely welcomed staff unless they had specific assignments because it contained Mr. Castellano's private office, conference room, and family library. Every employee understood that discretion mattered more than speed. Naomi entered the west hallway carrying clean sheets intended for one of the guest suites. Just before reaching the room, she heard unfamiliar voices drifting beneath the closed conference room door. At first, she paid little attention. Important meetings happened almost every day. She continued walking until one sentence caused her footsteps to stop without thinking. If he returns after 8 tonight, everything stays exactly on schedule. Naomi frowned. She recognized neither voice. Normally, Mr. Castellano attended every important strategy meeting personally, but his calendar clearly showed he would remain in Manhattan until evening. Curious only because the words sounded unusually specific, she carefully adjusted the stack of linens in her arms and continued toward the guest room. As she passed the conference room, the heavy folder resting on top of the linens slipped unexpectedly onto the polished floor. Papers scattered across the hallway with a soft flutter. Naomi immediately knelt to gather everything before anyone opened the door. As she reached beneath a nearby console table, she noticed something resting on its polished surface. It was Mr. Castellano's spare office key, attached to its distinctive silver leather keychain engraved with the family crest. She had seen it only once before when Mrs. Evelyn Brooks explained that the emergency key never left the private conference area unless Mr. Castellano personally carried it. Naomi stared at it for only a second before hearing another voice inside the room. Nobody expects him before tonight. We have plenty of time. The words were followed by quiet laughter. Naomi quickly stood, gathered the remaining papers, and hurried away before anyone could discover she had paused outside the door. She tried convincing herself she had misunderstood. Perhaps they were discussing a business presentation. Perhaps another executive shared a similar schedule. Yet something refused to settle inside her mind. During lunch, she passed the conference room again. The emergency key was gone. The hallway was empty. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Mrs. Brooks later mentioned that Mr. Castellano's meeting in Manhattan might run even longer than expected because of unexpected negotiations. Naomi smiled politely, but the conversation she had overheard echoed inside her thoughts throughout the afternoon. The more she replayed those calm, confident voices, the more one detail refused to disappear. They had not wondered whether he might return early. They had spoken as though they already knew exactly when he would not be home. Naomi spent the next several hours trying to convince herself that she had imagined the entire conversation. She focused on ordinary tasks, replacing fresh flowers in guest suites, polishing the grand staircase railing until it reflected the afternoon sunlight, and helping the kitchen staff prepare elegant table settings for the evening reception. Every familiar routine usually calmed her mind, but today each quiet hallway seemed to echo with the same sentence she could not forget. If he returns after 8 tonight, everything stays exactly on schedule. The words repeated themselves with unsettling clarity every time she reached the third floor. Shortly after 2 o'clock that afternoon, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks asked Naomi to deliver freshly pressed table linens to the private dining room adjacent to the conference suite. It was a simple assignment, one Naomi had completed dozens of times before. As she pushed the small service cart down the west corridor, she noticed something unusual. The conference room door, which normally remained completely closed during private meetings, stood open by barely 2 inches. From where she walked, she could not see inside, but she recognized one familiar voice speaking in an unusually restrained tone. Curious only because the hallway appeared completely empty, she continued forward without slowing. Then another sentence floated into the corridor. Once the announcement is signed tonight, nobody will question where the authorization came from. Naomi instinctively lowered her eyes and continued walking. She had learned long ago that overhearing conversations often brought unnecessary trouble. Yet before she reached the dining room entrance, another quiet voice answered. As long as he never realizes the schedule changed. Naomi stopped for only a heartbeat. Schedule changed. Those 3 words connected immediately with everything she had overheard earlier that morning. Her pulse quickened. She gently placed both hands on the service cart, pretending to adjust the folded linens while listening only long enough to determine whether she had misunderstood. She heard papers sliding across a polished table. Someone quietly laughed. Another person said, "The early draft stays locked away until tomorrow." Then the room became silent. Naomi immediately resumed walking, refusing to linger another second. She entered the dining room, completed her assignment, and left through the opposite hallway. Even after the voices disappeared behind thick wooden doors, an uncomfortable feeling settled inside her chest. Nothing she had heard directly described a crime. Nothing clearly identified anyone by name. Yet everything sounded carefully planned around one assumption. Mr. Castellano would not return until later that evening. While organizing glassware in the pantry, Naomi tried recalling whether anyone besides senior executives had known his exact schedule. Mrs. Brooks had mentioned the meeting during breakfast. The chauffeur knew. His executive assistant certainly knew. Perhaps several managers knew as well. But why would strangers inside a private conference room speak with such certainty about his movements? As the afternoon slowly faded toward evening, dark clouds gathered beyond the western gardens, dimming the warm sunlight that usually filled the estate with comfort. Naomi carried another stack of folded napkins toward the front hall when the sound of tires rolling across the gravel driveway reached her ears. She glanced through the tall front windows without thinking. Her heart nearly stopped. The familiar black luxury sedan had already passed through the front gates. William Castellano was home nearly 3 hours early. Every color seemed to drain from Naomi's face. She did not know exactly what was happening inside the mansion, but she knew one thing with complete certainty. Whoever had built their plan around his delayed arrival would never expect him to walk through the front door now. William Castellano remained perfectly still beneath the shadow of the mansion's stone columns, allowing Naomi to guide every movement with nothing more than subtle gestures. She quietly stepped toward the side entrance normally reserved for deliveries and housekeeping staff, glancing once toward the grand foyer before gently opening the narrow service door. Inside, the familiar warmth of the estate contrasted sharply with the growing uneasiness filling the silent corridors. Usually, employees greeted one another with polite smiles and quiet conversation before evening events. Today, every sound seemed strangely measured, as though the house itself had learned to whisper. William followed Naomi through the service hallway without asking a single question. It was the first time in years he had entered his own home without announcing his arrival. The narrow corridor looked completely different from the grand marble hallways guests admired. Stainless steel shelving, laundry carts, supply closets, and employee lockers lined the walls beneath simple overhead lights. William realized he had rarely walked this path, despite owning every inch of the estate. Naomi slowed near a small intersection where two hallways met. She raised one finger, asking him to wait. Soft voices drifted from somewhere ahead. William listened carefully. One employee pushed a cleaning cart across another hallway without noticing either of them. A chef hurried toward the kitchen carrying trays of freshly baked bread. Everything appeared completely ordinary. Yet Naomi did not move. Her eyes remained fixed on a doorway farther ahead, where faint conversation continued behind closed walls. William quietly leaned closer. The words were still impossible to distinguish clearly, but one familiar voice suddenly reached him. It belonged to Martin Ellison, his longtime senior advisor, a man who had managed countless foundation events and represented the Castellano family for more than 15 years. Martin sounded relaxed, confident. William frowned. Martin believed he was still in Manhattan attending negotiations until later that evening. Naomi noticed the subtle change in William's expression and quietly nodded, confirming that this was exactly why she had begged him to remain silent. She slowly guided him toward another narrow hallway used almost exclusively by maintenance staff. Hidden behind decorative wall panels and storage rooms, the passage overlooked portions of the conference suite through discrete observation windows originally designed so engineers could access electrical systems without disturbing meetings. William had almost forgotten the passage even existed. Naomi had discovered it accidentally during her second week while helping repair crews locate a plumbing valve. They stopped beside one of the concealed viewing panels. Through a narrow section of glass barely visible from inside the conference room, William finally saw the meeting taking place. Martin Ellison stood beside two unfamiliar men wearing expensive business suits. Contracts covered the polished conference table. One folder displayed the Castellano Foundation logo. Another contained several signature pages already marked with colored tabs. William carefully watched without speaking. Martin smiled politely while pointing toward a calendar projected onto a large display screen. By the time William reviews the final version tomorrow morning, he said calmly, every document will already appear properly approved. One of the visitors nodded. And he still believes tonight's meeting in Manhattan finishes after 8. Martin answered without hesitation. Exactly as planned. William felt no anger. Only quiet disbelief settled across his face. 15 years of absolute trust suddenly stood beside a sentence that should never have been spoken. Naomi slowly looked toward him, worried she had somehow misunderstood everything she had heard. Instead, William gave the smallest nod of acknowledgement. She had not interrupted him because she was frightened. She had interrupted him because she had chosen honesty over comfort, even knowing no one might believe the warning of a maid whom most people barely noticed. William remained motionless behind the concealed observation panel long after Martin Ellison finished speaking. The conference room looked exactly as it always had. Elegant walnut walls, polished leather chairs, crystal water glasses arranged with perfect symmetry, and documents spread neatly across the table. Nothing about the scene appeared suspicious to anyone walking past the closed door. That was what made it so unsettling. The greatest deception rarely announced itself with chaos. It often arrived wrapped in perfect manners and quiet confidence. Naomi carefully studied William's expression, expecting disappointment or disbelief. Instead, she saw something else. Years of leading one of the most respected organizations in New York had taught him that truth revealed itself only to those patient enough to observe before reacting. He slowly stepped away from the hidden window and motioned for Naomi to follow him deeper into the service corridor. Once they reached an empty maintenance room, he finally spoke. "Everything you heard this morning," he said quietly. "Tell me exactly as you remember it. Do not leave out a single word." Naomi took a slow breath, determined to recall every detail precisely. She repeated the conversations exactly as she had heard them, carefully separating facts from assumptions. She explained how she had dropped the stack of linens outside the conference room, how she had noticed the emergency office key resting on the console table, how one voice confidently stated that everything depended upon William returning after 8 o'clock, and how another person later mentioned that nobody would question the authorization once the documents had been signed. William listened without interrupting. The more she spoke, the more individual pieces quietly aligned inside his mind. None of the statements alone proved wrongdoing. Together, however, they formed a pattern built entirely around controlling information. He removed his phone from his jacket, but stopped before making a call. If Martin believed he was still in Manhattan, that misunderstanding had suddenly become their greatest advantage. William looked directly at Naomi. "No one else knows I am here." Naomi immediately shook her head. "Only the driver saw me meet you outside, sir. He left as soon as you entered through the service entrance." William nodded thoughtfully. "Good." He placed the phone back into his pocket without unlocking it. Instead of contacting security or confronting anyone immediately, he quietly led Naomi toward a small records office located beside the estate's administrative wing. Shelves filled with carefully organized event binders stretched from floor to ceiling. Every charity dinner, foundation meeting, and executive conference held at the estate had been documented for years. William opened the binder prepared for that evening's reception and slowly compared the printed schedule against the digital calendar displayed on the office computer. His eyes narrowed. The paper copy listed his return to the estate at 8:15 that evening. The secure calendar stored on his personal device still showed 6 o'clock before the canceled meeting. Someone had quietly modified only the printed event schedule distributed throughout the mansion. Every employee preparing the reception believed he would arrive much later than planned. Naomi watched him in complete silence. She finally understood why the conversations had sounded so confident. The people inside the conference room were not predicting his arrival. They believed they had already controlled it. William closed the binder and looked at Naomi with quiet respect. "You noticed something dozens of experienced people overlooked because you were paying attention instead of making assumptions." Naomi lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. She had spent months believing that being invisible was the safest way to survive inside the Castellano estate. Standing beside William now, she realized that sometimes the people no one notices become the only ones capable of seeing the truth. William carefully returned the printed event binder to its exact position on the shelf, making certain nothing suggested anyone had entered the records office. Every movement was deliberate, every decision measured. For years he had taught his executive team that the strongest advantage belonged to the person who understood more than everyone else while revealing less than anyone expected. Tonight, for the first time, that advantage had come from an observant housekeeper rather than an experienced advisor. He quietly opened the office door and listened. The hallway remained peaceful. Distant preparations for the charity reception continued exactly as scheduled. Staff members wheeled flower arrangements across polished marble floors. Musicians tested the acoustics inside the ballroom, and chefs discussed final dinner preparations in the kitchen. The mansion appeared perfectly normal, which only confirmed that whoever had altered the schedule still believed everything remained under complete control. William turned toward Naomi. "There is one more question," he said softly. "Why did you risk warning me?" Naomi looked down for a moment before answering. "Because everyone else expected me to keep cleaning." Her voice remained calm despite the emotion behind it. "If I had stayed quiet and something important happened because I ignored what I heard, I would never have forgiven myself." William studied her face carefully. There was no desire for recognition, no expectation of reward, only quiet honesty. That answer carried more weight than any explanation she could have prepared. Before he could respond, soft footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Naomi instinctively stepped aside while William moved behind a partially open storage door, remaining completely hidden from view. Martin Ellison walked past only seconds later, speaking politely with one of the estate administrators while reviewing several neatly organized folders. His expression remained relaxed, his voice steady, his confidence completely unchanged. "Everything is proceeding exactly according to schedule," Martin said with a satisfied smile. "Mr. Castellano will not arrive until after the reception begins, so we have plenty of time to prepare the final documents." The administrator nodded without hesitation. Neither man noticed that William stood only a few feet away, silently hearing every word. After they disappeared around the corner, William slowly exhaled. The certainty in Martin's voice revealed something even more important than the altered timetable. His trusted advisor genuinely believed no unexpected variable remained. That confidence could now expose every hidden detail of the plan without anyone realizing it. William looked toward Naomi once again. "You have already protected more than you know," he said quietly. "But I need one more favor." Naomi nodded immediately. "Anything, sir. Return to your normal duties. Speak to no one about what you heard. Let everyone believe today is completely ordinary." She hesitated only briefly before answering. "Yes, sir." As Naomi walked back toward the service wing carrying an empty linen basket she had deliberately picked up along the way, she once again became the invisible employee no one noticed. Staff members smiled politely as they passed her in the hallway. A florist asked where additional vases should be delivered. A chef requested fresh tablecloths for the dining room. Life inside the estate continued with comforting normality. Yet beneath that ordinary routine, everything had quietly changed. William remained alone inside the narrow corridor for another moment, watching the hidden pathways that connected every elegant room in the mansion. He suddenly understood something he had never considered during all the years he had owned the estate. The people who polished the floors, replaced the flowers, folded the linens, and quietly disappeared before every important meeting often witnessed more truth than the people sitting around the conference table. And because almost no one ever looked at them twice, they sometimes became the only guardians capable of protecting a house built on trust before that trust quietly disappeared. William waited until the evening reception officially began before making his next move. Guests gradually filled the grand ballroom beneath sparkling crystal chandeliers, greeting one another with polished smiles, while soft piano music floated through the elegant halls. Business leaders, foundation donors, judges, university presidents, and longtime family friends gathered around beautifully decorated tables, completely unaware that another meeting had quietly unfolded behind the mansion's polished walls only an hour earlier. Everything appeared flawless. That was exactly what Martin Ellison expected. William entered through the front staircase precisely at 8:15, matching the altered printed schedule that had been distributed throughout the estate. The moment Martin saw him, A brief expression of surprise flashed across his face before disappearing beneath years of practiced professionalism. "William," Martin said warmly as he walked forward with effortless confidence. "I hope the negotiations went well." William smiled politely. "Better than expected. Nothing more. No explanation. No unnecessary details." He simply allowed Martin to believe the carefully constructed illusion remained intact. Throughout dinner, William observed far more than he spoke. Every conversation, every exchanged glance, every folder quietly moved between assistants became another piece of a puzzle that had finally begun revealing its true shape. Naomi continued performing her duties exactly as instructed. She refilled water glasses, replaced serving plates, and quietly moved through the ballroom with the same invisible professionalism she had shown every day since arriving at the estate. Yet this time William occasionally noticed something he had overlooked for years. Whenever Naomi passed a table, people rarely looked directly at her. Important conversations continued uninterrupted because everyone assumed she was simply part of the background. That invisibility had allowed her to hear what no executive, attorney, or advisor ever could. Near the end of dinner, Martin quietly approached William carrying a leather folder. "There is only one authorization remaining for tomorrow's foundation announcement," he explained with his usual calm efficiency. "I prepared everything while you were away this afternoon to save you time." William accepted the folder without opening it. Instead, he looked toward the ballroom entrance where his executive assistant had just arrived carrying a tablet computer. "Excellent timing," William said pleasantly. "I received an updated version of today's schedule before I returned. There seems to be an interesting discrepancy." Martin's confident smile barely changed, but his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. William placed the unopened folder beside his plate and calmly requested that the ballroom's large presentation screen be activated. Several guests assumed another charitable announcement was about to begin. Instead, William displayed two nearly identical schedules side by side. One came directly from his secured digital calendar. The other was the printed version distributed throughout the estate earlier that day. The room gradually became silent as everyone noticed the difference. His arrival time had been quietly changed by more than 2 hours. No accusation followed. No raised voices interrupted the silence. William simply asked one question. "Can anyone explain when this revision was authorized?" No one answered immediately. Martin looked carefully at both schedules before quietly replying. "There must have been an administrative misunderstanding." William nodded thoughtfully, then pressed another button on the presentation screen. Security access records appeared beside the schedules. The conference room had been entered repeatedly that afternoon using the emergency office key. William slowly looked around the ballroom before allowing his eyes to rest on Martin. "Only 3 people knew where that key was stored," he said calmly. "One of them was me. One was Mrs. Brooks. The third was the person responsible for coordinating every executive meeting for the past 15 years. The silence that followed carried far more weight than any accusation. Around the room, respected colleagues, longtime partners, and loyal employees began realizing that the greatest surprise was not the altered schedule itself. It was discovering that the person trusted to protect the Castellano family's reputation had quietly built an entire plan upon the certainty that trust would never be questioned. No one in the ballroom spoke. The enormous room, filled only moments earlier with pleasant conversations and quiet laughter, became so still that the gentle sound of the fountain outside the open terrace doors seemed unusually loud. William Castellano did not raise his voice or accuse anyone of dishonesty. He simply allowed the evidence displayed across the large presentation screen to remain visible while every guest reached the same conclusion at their own pace. The digital calendar, the altered printed schedule, the emergency key access records, and the conference room entry log formed a story that no longer depended upon assumptions. It depended upon facts. Martin Ellison slowly placed both hands on the back of an empty chair, maintaining the composed expression that had earned everyone's confidence for more than 15 years. "William," he said evenly, "I believe there has been an unfortunate misunderstanding. Administrative revisions happen before every major event." William nodded politely. "They do." He walked toward the screen and pressed another button on the presentation remote. A second timeline appeared beside the first. It showed every authorized change made to the foundation schedule during the previous week, complete with digital approval records, employee identification numbers, and precise timestamps. Every legitimate revision had been properly documented. Only one alteration appeared without authorization: the delayed arrival time. The room remained silent as several board members leaned forward to study the records more closely. William looked toward his executive assistant. "Who requested this change?" She answered calmly. "No request was submitted, sir." The printed version was replaced after the approved copies had already been distributed. Another quiet wave of surprise moved across the ballroom. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks lowered her eyes, disappointed that such careful planning inside the estate had been quietly manipulated without anyone noticing. William turned back toward Martin, but there was neither anger nor satisfaction in his expression. Only disappointment. "For 15 years, he said quietly, "I trusted you to protect the integrity of every decision made inside this house." Martin hesitated before speaking again. "I believed I was protecting the foundation from unnecessary delays." William studied him for a long moment. Protecting something never requires hiding the truth from the person responsible for it. Those simple words settled over the ballroom more heavily than any accusation ever could. Several longtime donors slowly exchanged thoughtful glances. They understood the deeper issue was no longer a scheduling error. It was the quiet decision to replace transparency with private control. William calmly requested that the remaining foundation documents be reviewed independently before any future approvals moved forward. The board unanimously agreed without debate. The discussion ended there. No dramatic confrontation followed. No public humiliation took place. The truth alone had quietly redirected the evening. As guests gradually returned to their conversations, many found themselves looking toward the staff, moving silently throughout the ballroom. Naomi continued replacing empty glasses and collecting finished plates exactly as she had before, never seeking recognition for the role she had played. William noticed those glances. Before the evening concluded, he walked across the ballroom and stopped beside her service station. Every nearby conversation faded as people instinctively watched. Naomi looked up, uncertain whether she had forgotten another task. Instead, William offered a gentle smile. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not for interrupting your work today. Thank you for refusing to ignore your conscience." Naomi stood speechless. She had expected nothing more than another ordinary workday. Yet in that quiet moment, every employee, every guest, and every executive inside the Castellano estate witnessed something far more meaningful than the resolution of a hidden deception. They witnessed a powerful man publicly honoring the honesty of the one person almost everyone else had failed to notice. 1 month later, the Castellano estate welcomed another foundation gathering beneath the gentle warmth of an early autumn afternoon. Golden leaves drifted across the stone pathways, while sunlight reflected softly from the marble walls that had witnessed so many quiet conversations over the years. At first glance, everything appeared exactly as it always had. Fresh flowers decorated the entrance hall, elegant music floated through the ballroom, and employees moved with the same graceful professionalism that guests had always admired. Yet those who worked inside the mansion understood that something fundamental had changed. Trust was no longer measured by position alone. It was measured by character. Naomi Carter still wore the same simple black and white housekeeping uniform she had proudly cared for since her first day. She had politely declined William's offer to move immediately into an administrative office, explaining that she wanted to earn every future responsibility one careful step at a time. William respected that decision. Instead, he created a new employee advisory program that allowed every member of the household staff to report concerns directly without fear of being ignored simply because of their position. The policy quietly transformed the atmosphere inside the estate. Housekeepers, gardeners, chefs, drivers, and maintenance workers no longer felt invisible. Their observations mattered because William had finally understood that the people who quietly cared for a home often noticed the earliest signs that something needed attention. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks watched those changes with quiet satisfaction. She had managed the estate for many years, but even she admitted that the new culture felt stronger than the old one. Respect no longer traveled only from the top downward. It moved in every direction. Late that afternoon, William stood alone on the second-floor balcony overlooking the grand foyer as employees prepared for another evening event. Below him, Naomi calmly arranged fresh white lilies inside crystal vases while offering gentle guidance to two newly hired housekeepers who were still learning the routines of the estate. She smiled patiently as she explained every detail, treating them with the same kindness she once wished someone had shown her during her first uncertain days. William realized she had never changed. The only difference was that now everyone else finally noticed who she had always been. Mrs. Brooks quietly stepped onto the balcony beside him. "She never asked for recognition," she said softly. William nodded. That is exactly why she deserved it. At that moment, Naomi finished arranging the flowers and looked up by chance. Their eyes met across the elegant foyer. William offered a small nod of appreciation. Naomi answered with a warm smile before returning to her work, completely comfortable knowing that respect no longer required attention or applause. It simply existed where honesty lived. As evening settled outside, the mansion filled once again with welcoming light instead of uneasy silence. Guests admired the beauty of the estate without ever realizing how close it had once come to losing something far more valuable than reputation. Buildings could always be repaired. Schedules could always be rewritten. Even mistakes could become lessons. But trust survived only when ordinary people chose courage over convenience. William Castellano never forgot that the most important decision made inside his home that day had not come from an executive meeting or a boardroom discussion. It had come from the quiet voice of a Black Maid who refused to ignore her conscience. And from that day forward, everyone who entered the Castellano estate remembered that true power could command obedience, but only humility and integrity could earn lasting respect. And that day, the world quietly remembered what dignity truly looks like.